so much. And yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, it is exactly 3 weeks to first Seder. So we're getting in the Pesach spirit. And I will say that Pesach is my favorite holiday. So I am so excited to be teaching and with all of you today. I want to begin with a little bit of an introduction to what we'll be doing over the next 3 weeks and what inspired me to bring this text in particular. So over the next 3 weeks, today, next week, and the following week, we're going to be doing a deep dive into Mishnah Pesachim, Perek Yud, chapter 10. This is the final chapter in the Mishnah Tractate Pesachim, which of course the very extensive Gemara is based on, but we are only looking at the Mishnah, and we're looking only at the Mishnah because we want to get through the entire chapter, and the Mishnah, in fact, is the foundation for the Gemara. Gemara goes in all kinds of great places. If you haven't learned what this chapter is called, Arvei Pesachim, it's called Arvei Pesachim because of how it opens up. Definitely would encourage you to learn this chapter over the next few weeks and as we get into Pesach itself. But for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on the Mishnah. So let me back up and explain for folks who are not as familiar, what is the Mishnah and why learn the Mishnah independent of the Gemara? So we often think of the Mishnah as the thing that the Gemara is responding to, right? But the Talmud, which is the Mishnah and the Gemara together, was redacted in the late 5th and 6th century of the Common Era in Bavel, which is current-day Iraq. There is also, importantly, another Talmud called the Talmud Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud. That one is less studied, but it is no less important. So when people talk about the Talmud, they're usually referring to the Bavli. And the Mishnah was redacted by Yehuda Hanassi in the 3rd century of the Common Era, roughly in the year 200 of the Common Era. We are trying to figure out what the Hebrew calendrical date is. I believe it's something like 3,660 or 3,669. Although when I did my due diligence with HeapCal, I was informed that because of the Julian calendar switcheroo later on, it's hard to exactly have an accurate Hebrew date. But I think it's really important to include that because so often in academic discourse, when we talk about the Mishnah, we are using Gregorian dating and Julian calendrical dating. And this is a deeply Jewish and rabbinic text. And I think it's important to think about where it lands on our calendar, on the Jewish calendar. So great. What is this Mishnah and why is it something we continue to study? So the Mishnah is compiled or composed of multiple tractates, which are kind of like subsections, and each subsection has a particular topic area. And many of these tractates contain a lot of oral information that was passed down during the Second Temple period and after its destruction, because we know that the temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, the Second Temple in Yerushalayim, destroyed by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era on Tisha B'Av, as tradition understands it. And the Mishnah, as we have it, was redacted about 130 years later in 200 of the Common Era in the Galil, in the land of Israel. And we also know that the Mishnah had a lot of material that didn't quite make it into the actual text of the Mishnah. So that's another really interesting piece of this puzzle. Why is that, and what is that text, and how do we relate to that text? We are going to be working with the canonical text of Mishnah Pesachim Yud, chapter 10 of Mishnah Pesachim. We will be using the translation found on Sefaria, and we're going to be going through 3 Mishnayot a class session, ideally. We'll see what actually happens. My hope is that we will cover this chapter. And there are a couple of reasons why I think this chapter in particular is so critically important. So when we think of Pesach, we think of a lot of things. We think of cleaning ferociously, some of us do. We think of getting our homes ready, ridding them of chametz, of leavened products, getting ready for the Seder, or for some of us, 2 Seders, depending on where you're located in the world, and depending on what your custom is. There are many outside of Israel who only do 1 Seder, and those living in Israel only do 1 Seder, and there are many of those who live outside of Israel who do 2 Seders. So there's a variety of customs, but either way, however many Sederim you have, we are all as Jews commanded to have this meal on the 15th of Nisan, the first day of Pesach. And we know that according to the Jewish calendrical understanding, days begin in the evening. And so we begin our holiday, not even with the Seder, but as we'll see in the text in just a minute, with exactly at what point you can't have any food, period. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how the rabbis kind of understood this, is at what point are you no longer allowed to own chametz? Because I think those two in a lot of ways are related, but we'll also talk about what function the Seder had. And I think it's really important to lay out a couple of foundational ideas here. One of them is that some scholars hold, such as I'm thinking of Dr. Joshua Kulp of the conservative yeshiva in Yerushalayim, hold that the Seder, and this is a very commonly held scholarly view, that the Seder was inspired by classic Greco-Roman symposia. This is something that I certainly was taught many times by many very esteemed academics, and it's something that I think makes a lot of sense, that the idea is that rather than saying that the rabbis borrowed from the Greco-Roman symposia, in fact, the Greco-Roman symposia was the formal meal that upper class folks had, and that was the formal meal that they were accustomed to. So just like we today, if we're going to shul or we're going to somewhere fancy, we wear the clothing that most people in the given societies that we live in wear when they attend fancier functions. It's a similar phenomenon. Some people believe that actually the reason we have the Seder is because the rabbis believed deeply that the temple would be rebuilt, reconstituted immediately, and that we needed to have some way of remembering and being able to automatically reenact what we once did when we offered the Pesach sacrifice. So in the Torah, we actually have two separate but very distinctly connected holidays around this time of year. One of them is called Pesach, and the other is called Chag HaMatzot. And anyone who is familiar, if you're familiar with the Pesach liturgy, you'll notice that for kiddush, which we'll be talking a little bit about later, and in the Amidah for Pesach, when we refer to the day, when we do what's called the Kiddushat Hayom blessing, the blessing over the day, we refer to the time as Chag HaMatzot Zman Cherutenu, the festival of matzot, the festival of unleavened bread, time of our freedom. And yet we also colloquially call this time Pesach, even though Pesach actually is very much connected to the Passover sacrifice, which every single Jew is commanded to offer in a particular time, at a very particular time, in a very particular way. And the Torah in Exodus 12 describes that. We're not going to go into that inside today, but this is all just by way of background. So we are now, to fast forward a little bit, we're now at a period of time where we don't have the temple. And because we don't have the temple, we have no way of making the Passover sacrifice anymore. So because we have no way of making the Passover sacrifice anymore, we have to figure out exactly how to carry this extraordinarily important moment forward. Pesach is not, as we all know, as the understatement of all understatements, Pesach is a major, major holiday. And so because Pesach is a major, major holiday, it wasn't something that we could just put away by the wayside. This is something that the rabbis felt very strongly. We need to figure out how to carry forward, because we need to figure out exactly what it means to continue this tradition and to not forget our origin story, because ultimately that's what Pesach is. And when we're commanded to tell and retell with the Haggadah, which the Haggadah comes centuries after the Mishnah, this is one of the foundational texts for how that Haggadah gets to be canonized and codified. One of the things I thought about doing for this series actually was to look at different Haggadot and compare them. And then I realized that there were so many Haggadot that to try to do that would just not be doing any of it justice. And I felt that rather than try to do that, that actually instead what we would do is actually look at the foundational text from the Mishnah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, I'm going to read in the English, and I'm going to be pausing as I go. So Mara, if you could please share the source sheet, that would be great. You will notice that there are a lot of parentheticals in the English. That is often the Steinsaltz commentary and explanation of the text. I am going to add my own explanations as we go, but I'm also going to read some of what is available there. And I'm going to start with the first Mishnah in this tractate so we get us going. On the eve of Passover, adjacent to Mincha, a person may not eat until dark, so that he or she, we're going to just, apologies for all of the masculine language here, he, she, they will be able to eat matzah that night with a hearty appetite. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. So what is meant when we say the eve of Pesach, the time adjacent to the Mincha time? So to kind of get a sense of what exactly this means, the rabbis are really interested in thinking about holiday and Shabbat meals as meals that one should eat with a hearty appetite. So those of us who have now, not all of us, I'm sure on this call have yet, but those of us on this call who have gone through the time shift on Sunday when we moved from standard to daylight savings, and I know that different parts of the world encounter that time at different times, you will know that, of course, Shabbat is going to start an hour later this week. Now, technically, it doesn't physically start later, but because of our time shift, it temporally does, which means that for some folks, Shabbat's going to come in really late because sundown is later. It's after 7 p.m. now, and it might be really hard to want to eat that late. Maybe you want to have an earlier dinner. The rabbis say, no, actually, eating and dafka matzah, in our case here, is so important. It is a central mitzvah to eat matzah at the Seder, that you cannot eat anything after a particular time of the day. So mincha is a specifically halachically defined time when the afternoon prayer is offered. And there are two different times in which this can happen. There is mincha katana and mincha gedola. Mincha gedola, the large mincha, is a literal way to translate that, is from the earliest time you can daven mincha until a few hours before sunset, and then we move into something called mincha katana, which tends to be, according to many traditional commentators, the more preferred time to daven mincha. So in this instance, the rabbis are saying, okay, on the eve, so on the 14th of Nisan, this is a very important day. On the 14th of Nisan, this is the day we would have offered the sacrifice, the Pesach sacrifice. You cannot eat anything after the time for Mincha so that you can arrive to the Seder with a hearty appetite. So that's piece one. So even the poorest of Jews should not eat the meal on Passover night until he reclines on his left side, as free and wealthy people recline when they eat. And the distributors of charity should not give a poor person less than 4 cups of wine for the festival meal of Passover night. And the halacha applies, and again, there's a little bit of commentary here, even if the poor person is one of the poorest, excuse me, I'm going to flip my page over, is one of the poorest members of society and receives his food from the charity plate. So, great, what's going on here? It is extremely important. We have 2 distinctive things happening. We're told that you need to have a hearty appetite, and that every single person should be able to recline to their left which free and wealthy people do. And again, this goes back to the idea of the Greco-Roman symposia, when reclining to one's left was certainly a thing that was done. And that was a sign of luxury and freedom. There's an idea that people would sit on these small couches and you'd have these very small tables and you'd have all these pillows. You know how often, I don't know if any of you have experienced this at a Seder, but sometimes people will do the Magid section on their actual couches to try to reenact this. The notion that you had a pillow behind you, you were reclining, you had a little table in front of you. It's the notion of this incredibly luxurious experience. So that's what's going on here in terms of this descriptor. And the Mishnah is very clear that this applies to every single member of the people of Israel, regardless of their economic circumstances. So that if you are someone who relies on tzedakah, on what often gets translated as charity, although charity is not the greatest translation of tzedakah, but if you are reliant on tzedakah from the community, you are obligated to receive 4 cups of wine, just like everybody else, because 4 cups of wine at the Seder is, as we know, a very important part of this. And you also should be able to have enough so that you can recline and enjoy the meal as well. So that is our opener. And it's really interesting that that's our opener, because we're about to move into a dispute around the first step of the Seder. So we're kind of being introduced to the Seder as this meal that's supposed to happen in a very particular way. And now we're going to really kind of delve into what exactly is this meal, this thing that we're doing, and how does one do the thing that we're doing? So before I move into the next piece of this, just another reminder, again, we will see as we go on, the way that we do our Seder today is a bit different from this, but the reason I think it's really important to talk about this is because this is the foundation for how we do our Seders today. And so because this is the foundation for how we do our Seders today, it felt really important to kind of bring it in to this larger conversation around what exactly it means to have this ritual meal and what purpose is it serving. So we're going to now move on to our next text, and this is going to be a little bit of an explanatory experience as well. So the Tana describes the beginning of the Passover Seder. The attendants poured the wine with the first cup for the leader of the Seder. And the house of Shammai says one recites the blessing over the sanctification of the day, i.e. the kiddush, and the festival, who blesses Israel and the festivals. So, okay, we're assuming here that this was a kind of a meal where there were folks who were serving. I just want to note, I want to pause here, and I want to ask and invite us to think about the question, what does it mean to have folks actually pouring the wine? That is the Steinfeld's commentary of this, that you had folks pouring the wine. And that is really interesting juxtaposition, given that we're talking about a holiday of freedom. So we're just going to pause there. So when the first cup was poured, now again, to just kind of backtrack a second, a lot of folks have the practice, I believe, of pouring wine for one another at the Seder table, or pouring grape juice. We should note here a couple of very important things. Number one is that in the ancient world, people would dilute their wine with water because it was seen as extraordinarily problematic to just drink wine out of the glass. That was seen as very abhorrent behavior. And so again, as we're thinking about wine and great beverages, we know that there are many in our communities for whom wine is not accessible for numerous reasons, and therefore some of us use only grape juice. But the point is that we begin our Seder with a grape beverage, wine or grape juice itself, and we are immediately struck with the question, how do we bless this beverage? So the kiddush, anyone who knows the that lovely Seder tune that some of us may already have in our head, that recounts the 15 steps of the Seder, we know that the first step is Kadesh. And that's what we're talking about right now is kiddush. How do you make kiddush? In which order do you make the blessings? Do you start with Borei Peri Hagafen, or do you start with Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim? So we have here that Beit Shammai says, first you recite the blessing over the day, and then you recite the then you recite Borei Peri Hagafen. So first you would say Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim, and then you would say Borei Peri Hagafen. So Beit Hillel, so the house of Hillel says one recites the blessing over the wine and thereafter recites the blessing over the day. So here we have Beit Hillel saying we recite the blessing over the wine, Borei Peri Hagafen, and then over the day, Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim. We follow, and when I say we, I mean contemporary Jewry, we follow Beit Hillel in this as in most things. And the reason for Beit Hillel saying that we in fact recite the blessing of the wine and then the blessing for the festival is because Borei Peri Hagafen is a very frequent blessing. If a person is having a glass of wine or a glass of grape juice, they say over that beverage, Borei Peri Hagafen, or and they'll say Borei Peri Hagafen and then drink the glass. Whether it's Shabbos, whether it's a holiday, whether it's just any night of the week, if you're having a glass of wine, traditionally one would make the blessing over that glass of wine. So therefore, according to rabbinic understanding, you do the thing that is most frequent first, before doing the thing that is less frequent. And we know that in this case, the rabbis are arguing. When I say we know, what I'm saying is the rabbis are arguing that the festivals come 3 times a year. They're very infrequent. This is a relatively infrequent blessing in the scheme of blessings. So it would make total sense to say it secondarily. And so what Beit Shammai would argue is that actually, no, you should first make the blessing over the festival because that is the entire reason you're blessing the wine. Nevertheless, we go with Beit Hillel, and that is how we start our meals. We start our meal with this extraordinarily important moment. This actually is very aligned with how most holiday and Shabbat meals begin with kiddush. So in a lot of ways, Pesach starts to get different after the kiddush. And we're going to continue with our third Mishnah, and then we will open it up for some Q&A. So hold on 1 second as I turn my page. We've gotten past our kiddush. Now we're going to figure out what's coming next. So now we don't quite know whether or not people would recite the Haggadah before all of this or after. So in our context, we recite the Haggadah in the middle of all of this. So we're not quite sure how it happened in the time of the Mishnah, but we're going to just go with the text as we have it here. So the folks would bring vegetables before the leader of the Seder prior to the meal, if there were no other vegetables on the table, and the leader then dips the haroset into the water or the vinegar, taste some food before he reaches the dessert of the bread. The dessert of the bread, i.e., the bitter herbs which were eaten after the matzah. They brought before him matzah, haroset, and they chaseret and haros, said at least 2 cooked dishes in honor of the festival. I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a complicated commentary. I'm going to just kind of go and explain this a little bit more simply according to the actual Hebrew of the text here, which is that that before anything really got started, folks would bring to the leader the chareset, and before the actual telling of the story. And usually this was, in fact, the lettuce that was dipped as an appetizer. And we now call this karpas. And many of us use lettuce as our karpas. This comes from a Hebrew or Aramaic word for celery, has to do with spring vegetable. We also know, as we see here in the text as well, that we are introduced to something called the charoset, which again is the very delicious paste that is made of dates and apples and some spices, some cinnamon. I'm thinking about what usually I put in mine, and some nuts. And we often think of this as the thing that we use later in the Seder. We don't do this for karpas today, but the thing that we use later on when we are remembering the mortar of the bricks and slavery that we experienced. And we use it, of course, to make our Hillel sandwich. And we have a particular mitzvah to eat this with the bitter herbs later on in the Seder as we have it today. And it seems like here, some of this was a little bit put together in ways that we have now separated, which is really an interesting piece, because even though eating charoset itself is not a mitzvah, it is now a custom that is so strong that I can't imagine anyone not doing it. And now we eat this with the bitter herbs later in the Seder. So we do have the mitzvah to eat the we do eat the karpas. We make a blessing over the vegetables for that. And we also have the mitzvah, the custom of using the charoset with the bitter herbs, which we do have a direct mitzvah to eat the bitter herbs, putting them in a sandwich together, calling it the Hillel sandwich, which is a zecher of Hillel, and how he would eat the paschal offering together with the charoset, with the bitter herbs, and the matzah and all of that together. We do ours as a remembrance of his. So I'm going to summarize a little bit of what we were introduced to here. And then I'm going to open it up for some questions, some explorations, some back and forth. I consider this to be a co-learning space. So please do not hesitate to jump in with any questions, clarifications on any of what I've explored today. And I'm really looking forward to continuing with all of you. So as we talked about before, we have a very famous chapter of Mishnah, Pesachim Yud, Mishnah, chapter 10 of Mishnah Pesachim. We have an exploration of exactly how the mitzvah of the Seder meal, or rather the mitzvah, the reenactment of the Exodus, how that all happened. We have the exploration of kiddush. In which way should you make the blessing? Should you first say the blessing over the wine? Should you first say the blessing over the day? We have our dispute between Hillel and Shammai. And then we have this very lengthy exploration, which again, I apologize, there's a lot of commentary mixed into the Mishnah text. I encourage folks to look at it in their source sheets as well, around what the leader of the Seder would have placed in front of him. Unfortunately, it would be him only at this time, before the actual meal. And this is where we got into the exploration of the lettuce, of the charoset, which is understood by some scholars to have originated in this period as a food delicacy, and it might have been added on to the Seder because we needed more food items at the Seder. I feel like it's a really interesting, the ways in which we interact with food as cultures and communities is very interesting. So charoset is one of those things that has become extraordinarily essential in Pesach preparations and thinking about what kind of charoset you're going to get. And there are lots of different ways of understanding, is eating the charoset a mitzvah? So Rabbi Elazar, then Rabbi Tzadok Omer, mitzvah. And when the temple stood, they would bring before the body of the Pesach offering And that's why we eat this charoset alongside all of these other pieces, because it is a mitzvah to eat the charoset, because when the temple stood, they offered the Passover sacrifice with the charoset, as we do now. We constitute that as our Hillel sandwich. So we're getting introduced in this Mishnah to lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of the foods, of the ritual foods of the Seder. We've certainly not gotten to all of them, but we are certainly talking about the bitter herb, the karpas, we're talking about the charoset, we're talking about a little bit of bitter herbs, we're talking about how do you eat all these things together. And so I'm now going to pause and open it up to some questions. And so the way we'll do this is, if there are any in the chat, I am not able to access the chat while I'm presenting. So if there are any in the chat, I will invite Mara to read those aloud, and we'll go from there. And please feel free to put any questions you have into the chat. And if we have time, we will invite folks to unmute. But right now, we're going to focus on the chat.
Thanks so much, Rabbi. We have a few questions, and you finished with some food-related questions, and we have a few of those in the chat as well.
Okay, great.
Deborah was curious about the word for celery, or the word for the lettuce. Is that in the text? Is it Aramaic? Is it the same as it's seen in our Haggadah today?
Yes, so the actual word in the Mishnah, in the actual Hebrew of the text for we do not in this, I'm looking back through it again before so I don't misspeak. We don't see the word karpas in this Mishnah. Instead, we see and I'll give you the shoresh of this as well. I'll give you the root of this as well. We see the root, the charetzet. So chet, zayin, resh, the chatzeret, the lettuce, as opposed to the charoset. Very similar pronunciation, very different words, charetzet and charoset. So we don't have karpas as we experience it now. We instead have a different word that basically means a similar derivation having to do with likely lettuce, which was the bitter herb. Some folks actually still will use lettuce as both karpas and a bitter herb. Usually I use celery for karpas, but you can also use anything green, potatoes, anything like that as a sign of spring. And so in this case, we're not really getting so much of that, although we are definitely getting a sense that vegetables should be dipped, and the way that that kind of evolved is a really interesting thing that I would love to dig into a little bit more.
Thank you. So Fira has asked, why do we recline on the left side? Does the text dive into that at all, or is it just sort of assumed that when people reclined during this era, it was going to be to the left?
I am going to look into this more for next session, but my understanding to this point is that it was just basic assumption that, of course, during this era, you would recline to the left as a sign of freedom. I think it was one of those cultural associations based on where they were located, where they were located in terms of social location, given that in that time, the land of Israel was under Roman rule. And so that would have just been a given that that's what you did. You reclined to the left, and that was a sign of freedom.
Thank you. And there's also a few people who are asking about particular customs and laws that are associated with Pesach, that they're wondering if there's a root in this Mishnah or in this chapter. One being, I'm sorry?
Let's go through those, absolutely.
Yeah, sure. So one is about the fasting of firstborns. And where is that spoken about? And the other is we spoke a lot today about kiddush, but also there is candle lighting that often happens. And so is that part of this Mishnah as well?
I love these questions. This is why I think learning this text is so important, because as we see through these questions, our practice has tremendously evolved. So in terms of the fast of the firstborn, which for folks who are not aware, there is a fast on the eve of Pesach, so on the 14th of Nisan, that firstborn folks usually, in most communities, it's firstborn males. There are some communities where women also participate in this, but it is a remembrance and a moment of gratitude to Hashem, because the final plague, which precipitated the Exodus, was the plague of the killing of the Egyptian firstborn. We see this very graphically described in the Torah. And so the fast of the firstborn is a way for firstborns to reflect upon their deliverance, having not been affected by that particular plague. Some people also feel that this is a fast that allows at least one person to spend the day in reflection before the Seder, because we all, I'm sure many of us know, regardless of what our role is on Erev Pesach, that Erev Pesach is an extremely busy day. Whether you're traveling, whether you're prepping the Seder, whether you're going over the Haggadah to make sure you got everything in order, pun unintended there, like whatever you're doing on the 14th of Nisan, 3 weeks from today, sorry to remind folks that 3 weeks from today, it's a very, very busy time. So I think that there is what to reflect upon that, and that is, as we go on, I do not believe that comes up here. However, I will look into that and try to remember to answer that for next week. And similarly, candle lighting. So in Masechet Shabbat, in the Tractate of Shabbat, we have an entire chapter, the second chapter, called Bameh Madlikin, with what may you light. Some communities have the custom of reciting this chapter on Friday nights between between Kabbalat Shabbat and Ma'ariv. Some folks do this in full very quickly. Some folks maybe don't do this or do something differently, or may just have a teaching, or in most communities that I'm in, honestly, we go right from Kabbalat Shabbat to Ma'ariv. But this is a chapter where the rabbis talk extensively about exactly which kind of flames can you use and which kind of materials. We don't yet get the sense that this is something that one does for Pesach, although of course we know that candle lighting is something that we do for every single holiday, including of course Pesach, and that happens certainly before kiddush, 18 minutes before sundown. We light the candles to usher in Pesach, but that is not traditionally considered to be part of the actual Seder. That is more considered to be a necessary thing for the beginning of the Yom Tov itself. And particularly for those of us this year who will experience a 3-day Yom Tov for the first 3 days of Passover, we have quite a bit to do before we even get to the Seder. So wonderful question. And I look forward to exploring all of these in greater depth. And I'd love to know if there are any other questions.
Sure. I think this may also be material you get to in later weeks, so feel free to either address it or put a pause for later. But we have questions about the Seder plate. And so we've talked through a little bit of what the karpas is, what we will, I'm sure we'll talk about other symbolic foods involved at the Seder. Did the rabbis of the Mishnah talk about a physical Seder plate, or were these symbols that that were expected to be there, but they weren't necessarily congregated in a physical plate itself?
So you're absolutely right that we're going to get to this in later weeks. So I'm really excited to dive in as we get to different parts of the Haggadah and different parts of the Seder itself. My best understanding, and I will get clarity on this as well, is that the rabbis of the Mishnah, we have these beautiful Seder plates today with all the different sections, and it's this beautiful piece of Judaica that lots of us have, and we are very excited to put it all together. I don't get the sense that even though this was a very fancy meal in the time of the Mishnah, that they necessarily were using the exact kind of configuration that we are using today, even with the symbolic foods. And of course, that especially given that today some of us include more symbolic foods on the plate than were even classically put in there in the Haggadah. So we are going to get to more of that, and I'm going to give us some time to explore that as we go on in the next 2 sessions.
Sure. We have a few questions in the chat about the attendant.
Yes.
And I imagine there's lots to be said there. Rabbi Joan, I see that your hand has been up. I will ask you to unmute, and maybe you can, maybe the hand was up by accident. Okay, so I will read some of these questions. I think let's start. Who are these attendants? What does it mean to be having an attendant for a holiday celebrating freedom?
So I don't know if any of you have read Dara Horn's book. I think it's either called like All Other Nights. If somebody knows the title of the book I'm thinking of, I'm completely blanking on it right now, but it's a novel where she talks about Pesach in a Southern Jewish community during the Civil War. If anyone can think of the name of this book, it opens with a description of folks who are enslaved, literally serving their enslavers a Pesach Seder. And you sit there, and at least when I read this book, I'm sitting there going, irony of ironies. I'm not even quite sure what to do with how tremendously ironic this even is, right? And I remember thinking to myself, like, what does one do with this? So the best understanding that I have currently, and I'm really committed to deepening my understanding of this as we go forward, because I think this is one of the most important pieces that we need to unpack, is that so first of all, let's back up a second. The Mishnah is a very particular text for a very particular class of people. That's one thing to bear in mind. We think of the Mishnah now as like a canonized part of how we understand the oral Torah, and it's something that all folks are able to study. But if we're thinking about when the Mishnah was actually composed and who it was directed to, and I think this is very clear in how we read it, right? This text is the oral teachings and tradition of the rabbinic elite. And I don't mean that with judgment, right? When I say the oral traditions of the rabbinic elite, that is simply to say that the Mishnah, as we have it now, is the record of a class of people called rabbis who wanted to carry Judaism forward in a very particular way. And it took several centuries for this to become the dominant way of doing Jewish in the Jewish world. But we did get to the point where we are all now, by dint of how history unfolded, rabbinic Jews. Now, there were many, many folks who did not accept the authority of the rabbis, called Ka'arites. There are still several 100,000, I believe, who are still around today, mostly in certain places in Israel and in San Francisco and probably other places, most of whom originally came from Egypt, which is interesting in this context. Why do I bring them up? Because the rabbinic authority that is assumed in the Mishnah was not something that was assumed across the Jewish world for centuries. So in this context, we have a very elite group of people, some of whom, and this is where we get to the attendant piece, some of whom had some kind of servant. Now, this is one of those areas that I frequently teach Mishnah with an organization called Svara. And this is an area that we have talked extensively about pedagogically. How do we address the issue of what an Eved or an attendant, quote unquote, is here? How do we understand that in our contemporary context? What is that? Who is this person? How were they treated? These are all questions that I think we're still really trying to work through. At least I know I am trying to really work through, but my understanding to this point, and again, we're going to keep coming back to this, is that the attendant was someone who had some kind of indentured servitude relationship. It was not like a scenario where the person was owned like American chattel slavery. However, it was a terrible, terrible institution. No matter however you slice it, it was wrong. I'm glad we do not have this anymore. And it is also very interesting because the irony, of course, stands that how can you have this institution when you're talking about something as consequential as Chag HaMatzot, Zman Cherutenu, the time of our freedom? That is one of the challenges here. And the way that I approach these things is that both are true. We have this festival of tremendous national liberation and collective liberation, and we live in cultural contexts where our values are often not made manifest by our choices. So this is a reminder to all of us, thinking about, I think about this a lot with Pesach, right? How do we show up in our observance and celebration of Pesach? In what ways are we placing the labor of the Seder on one person, two people, whatever it is? What are the assumptions we're making that don't align with the ideas that Pesach is Zman Cherutenu? Even thinking about cleaning for Pesach, this is an opportunity for us to really step back and say, what is the actual religious requirement versus how has that become sociologically and culturally understood? And I'd imagine those of us on this call who engage in Pesach, like cleaning, can really relate to this because it can become an incredible tircha, an incredible burden. And you could think, like, why am I doing this? So this moment of talking about the attendant serving the meal or serving the cooked dishes or whatever it is in the third Mishnah, let's just honor that that's in this text, and let's use that as an opportunity for us to reflect on our own practices. That would be my charge to us given this particular text. But we are going to continue to come back to this theme.
Thank you. And I see, Rabbi Joan, your hand is up once again, so I will ask you to unmute. I don't know what's happening. I'm sorry. We're having some tech issues. And I will say that a few different participants have messaged me the name of Dara Horn's book, which seems to be All Other Nights.
I thought it was something like that. Thank you. All Other Nights. Yes. Read the first chapter of that and you will probably be struck by the irony.
Thank you. And I think you touched on this a bit, but in Rabbi Joan's comment in the chat, she's also thinking about the gender dynamics and what does it mean for, in this time, obviously men were leading the Seder and women were doing a lot of the prep work. In what ways is that different today? In what ways is that the same? And what does it look like to try and divide labor fairly when preparing for the Seder? I don't imagine the Mishnah necessarily talks to that, but maybe.
Well, exactly, Rabbi Joan. Thank you very much. Yes, unfortunately, and I'm sure many of us, and actually this would be a wonderful opportunity if we want to put into the chat our own personal experiences with this, right? I am afraid that many of us in this room can probably attest to the fact that, in fact, not a ton has changed. Yes, we are. This is a text that is directed to men. Again, going back to the very closed nature of the rabbinic class of people. And so I think a lot of us are really, really grappling with that in our own family structure, in our own communal structure. Who does what task to make Pesach happen? How do we, and I think about this a lot in terms of gender and labor, what are some choices we can make all year so that Pesach is easier? And I know that might sound a little bit like, wow, all year, but I think about this all the time. For example, it is my practice now to only eat in my kitchen. Why? Because when it comes time for Pesach, I don't have to worry that chametz got somewhere else in the house. Now, if you have small children, that is obviously extraordinarily difficult to enforce. And obviously, there have to be ways of making it sustainable, right? A rule like that is not going to work for every household. But thinking about choices that we make all year, how those choices affect our experience of Passover and the labor, meaning that we can choose to be in our homes in a way that makes the cleaning easier, right? We can think about intentionally who's going to have which kind of responsibility for which part of the house, which part of the kitchen, which appliance, X, Y, and Z. So really thinking about all those things. And then also the shopping and the hosting and the menu planning and just everything that goes into it. I think it is critically important, right, that we are thinking about all of this around gender and who is doing what in what context. These are extremely, extremely important areas.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone in the chat who's shared the ways in which they are preparing and thinking about division of labor, and it's lovely to see. I'm curious, I do feel there are times where in liturgy or in we are told that we are supposed to feel a certain way doing a certain act. And so in terms of cleaning for Passover, did the rabbis have a feeling that they were asking, or were they explicit in the feeling that they were asking the cleaners to do, or are there any feelings that the rabbis have talked about in terms of Pesach itself?
I really love that question. And through my learning, and I would love to hear other people's thoughts as well, I don't think the rabbis really, at least to the extent that I have the knowledge at this point, I don't think the rabbis really spend a lot of time thinking about the perspective of the cleaning and what that all involves. I think the bigger issue is make sure you get rid of chametz and make sure you either burn what's ever left or dispose of it. We now have this huge compilation of halacha, how you clean and how you kasher, you know, bidikat chametz and biur chametz, the searching for chametz, you know, on the evening of the 14th of Nisan, and the burning of the rest of it the next morning. And some folks have the practice of selling chametz, which that was really done because of the desire to prevent massive economic loss, particularly when it came to things like beer and scotch, or things that people were selling for business purposes. So I think that the way that we're supposed to feel around all of this, I don't know if that gets explored the way it ought to. And maybe that again goes back to the rabbis have a, you know, and I'm saying this with love for the rabbinic tradition, we are certainly influenced by our lived experience. So if you're not the one doing the cleaning of the house, you're probably not thinking about that, right? And I think that we've become more and more sensitized, hopefully, at least some of us, to the idea that like our experiences are just inherently subjective because we have different life experiences. And so when we open ourselves up to the experiences of other people, we become more enriched. I think what an interesting complement to this study that we could explore, and I could even bring some of this in perhaps in the future weeks, is women's supplications. There are beautiful books of these talking about different aspects of ritual life. Women had, for many, many centuries, and to this day in many communities still, certainly had a entire separate sphere of religious life, because the synagogue was, it wouldn't be off limits, but it wasn't really a place that women went. So women developed what were called techinas, which were prayers or supplications. And there are often a lot of these having to do with different holidays. So I'm happy to, as a complement to the Mishnah, we can bring in some of those texts and see if we can get some answers to these very important questions around how people felt around different aspects of preparation for Pesach.
Thank you. And we are almost at time. So Rabbi Lauren, I don't know if you want to leave us either with a closing thought or maybe a little bit of a teaser for next week.
Yeah, so I'll leave us with a little bit of a closing thought, which is that, you know, the Seder is such an important ritual, and the rabbis really care about getting it right in their way, because it wasn't just an issue of oh, it's a nice ceremony. This is an issue of remembrance and possibly reenacting a ritual that might actually become available to us in the very near future. The rabbis held, I mean, some scholars believe that, in fact, many of the rabbis of the Mishnah believe that the temple would be rebuilt immediately or as soon as possible. Now, 2,000 years later, we're in a different spot. And also these questions around the temple being rebuilt are very, 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 especially today, extremely complicated. So we're not going to get into all of that, but it's critically important to know that they are complicated. But what I will say is that thinking about how this ritual happens is really important. And also get yourselves ready for next week, because we're going to be beginning with one of our most favorite songs from the Seder. Hope you all have it in your head. Get ready. We're going to explore that. We're going to explore the 4 questions. So looking forward to next week.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi. And thank you all for being here. And we will see you next week. Have a great day. Bye-bye, everyone.